All right, when you hear AI safety, what comes to mind? Probably rogue AIs, right? Killer robots, some kind of sci-fi apocalypse. But what if the most pressing danger isn't some far-off superintelligence, but something happening right now, a fundamental breakdown of our economic systems? We're diving into a position paper that makes exactly that case. It argues we need to shift our focus from these distant existential risks to the immediate threats AI poses to work, to jobs, and to economic justice.
So here's how we're going to break it down. First, we'll look at how this paper completely redefines AI safety. Then we'll get into 6 specific risks it flags for the job market. After that, we'll cover the pro-worker framework it proposes, see how it holds up against some counterarguments, and wrap up with its big idea, expanding what safety even means in the first place. Okay, so let's get right into it. The paper's main argument is honestly a huge challenge to the way things are normally done. It's saying that the AI safety world has been so focused on these big, flashy, catastrophic risks, rogue AI, bioterrorism, that it's completely missed the more subtle but maybe even more dangerous disruptions that are already starting to happen in our society. Exactly. And that brings us to the core thesis of the paper, summed up in this quote. The idea is simple but powerful. AI safety cannot and should not be separated from what's happening in the labor market. You just can't say you're building safe or beneficial AI if that same technology is gutting the middle class and creating massive economic instability. The paper argues these two things are fundamentally intertwined. It's a night and day difference, really. The conventional view treats AI safety almost like a pure computer science problem. It's about aligning code with human values to stop a disaster. But this paper says, hold on, that's way too narrow. It reframes it as a socio-technical problem. The tech doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's embedded in our economy and society. So safety has to include its economic impact. The goal isn't just this vague align with values idea. It becomes something much more tangible, protecting people's jobs and making sure the benefits of AI are actually shared, not just hoarded by a few. Okay, so that's the big picture redefinition. But how does this actually look in the real world? Well, the paper gets very specific, identifying 6 critical dangers that generative AI brings to the table, starting with a concept most people in tech will recognize, but applied in a totally new way. Right. So the first risk is what the paper calls technical debt. Anyone in software knows this term. It's what happens when you take shortcuts to ship something fast, knowing you'll have to pay the price later to fix it. The paper argues we're doing the same thing, but on a societal scale. This AI arms race means companies are rushing out these powerful models, often with opaque data and unexamined biases. And in doing so, we're building up a massive societal technical debt. Things like misinformation becoming baked into our information ecosystem, or a total lack of accountability. These are problems society is going to be stuck paying for a long, long time. And this isn't just a metaphor. The paper actually grounds this idea in economic theory, specifically something called intertemporal consumption theory. Now, the basic idea here is that people make financial plans for their whole lives based on having a somewhat predictable career. You save while you're working so you can spend when you're older. Simple enough. But when AI throws a giant wrench of uncertainty into the job market, that entire model just breaks. People can no longer plan for the future, so they might start hoarding cash out of fear. Consumption drops, the economy gets shaky, and that's the societal debt starting to come due. The next 2 risks the paper brings up are really 2 sides of the same coin. The first is how quickly we're moving from AI as a helpful assistant to AI as a full-on replacement, from assistance to automation. And this is happening at the same time we're seeing the rise of what economists call extractive institutions. Think of the giant AI labs, which are basically set up to funnel the benefits of this technology to a very small group of people instead of spreading it around. And the impact on workers is pretty brutal. It's like a triple whammy. First, this rapid automation just makes the skill gap wider and wider, benefiting a small group of highly skilled people. For everyone else, their skills are suddenly easier to automate, which means their bargaining power with employers just evaporates. And that leads directly to wages staying flat, or even worse, jobs disappearing altogether. It creates this vicious cycle that just pumps up the inequality between the people who own the AI and the people who work. All right, then the paper kind of zooms out to look at 2 even bigger risks. One is global, and the other is, well, it's about our brains. The first they call uneven democratization. Basically, since AI is being developed in just a handful of rich countries, it's creating a kind of data colonialism, where everyone else just consumes the tech but doesn't get to build it. The second risk is impaired learning. This is the idea that if we rely on AI too much for thinking and creating, we could end up in an algorithmic monoculture,
where everyone's ideas start to sound the same, and we actually lose our critical thinking skills. And this brings up a really interesting problem. Why is it so hard to fix some of these things? The paper uses the classic prisoner's dilemma to explain it, using watermarking as an example. Look, we'd all be better off if we could easily tell what's AI generated, right? That's the societal good. But for any single AI company, there's a huge incentive not to watermark their stuff. They're worried their output will seem clunky or less natural than a competitor's. So, unless there's a rule forcing everyone to do it, the most rational move for each company is to do nothing, which leads to this terrible outcome for everyone. In the last risk, they detail a huge one we're all hearing about: copyright exploitation. On one side, the AI companies are saying, hey, this is fair use. We're not copying and pasting, we're learning, and besides, licensing the whole internet is impossible. But from the creator's perspective, it's just exploitation. They see these models ingesting their entire body of work to learn how to mimic their unique style, which could literally put them out of a job. It fundamentally devalues their craft and their livelihood. So that's a pretty grim list of risks. But the paper doesn't just stop there. After laying out the problems, it shifts gears and proposes a pretty detailed pro-worker framework for how we could actually govern AI and steer it in a better direction. It's really a 6-point plan. First, beef up the social safety net to support workers through this transition. Second, promote real competition, mainly by encouraging open source AI so we don't end up with a monopoly. Third and fourth are technical fixes with policy teeth. Get better at detecting AI content and, solving that prisoner's dilemma we talked about, mandate watermarking for everyone. Number 5 is huge. Protect creative workers by requiring companies to disclose what data they trained on and creating new ways to pay creators. And finally, and this is crucial, avoid regulatory capture. Make sure that workers, not just corporations, have a real voice when the rules are being written. And on that compensation point, the paper points to some really interesting ideas from academia, like something called the Shapley royalty share. It's a concept from game theory, and it's much more sophisticated than just a simple licensing fee. It actually tries to calculate the specific value that each individual piece of data, say one artist's work, contributed to a specific AI output. It's a potential way to create a system of micro-royalties that could fairly compensate potentially millions of creators, getting us out of this deadlocked fair use debate. Okay, but a good argument has to be able to stand up to criticism, right? And to its credit, the paper does exactly that. It takes on some of the biggest counterarguments head on. So what's the first big challenge to this whole idea? I imagine it's the classic "the market will figure it out" argument. You nailed it. That's the main one. Proponents of this view look at history, the Industrial Revolution, the Digital Revolution, and they say, look, technology always displaces some jobs, but it ultimately creates new ones. They argue that markets are incredibly dynamic, and new industries we can't even imagine will pop up. Their fear is that if you regulate too heavily, you'll choke off the innovation that's needed to create that growth and those new jobs. So basically, they're saying the paper is sounding the alarm way too early. Okay, so what about the other major counterargument? This one comes from inside the AI safety community itself, right? That's right. This argument basically says, labor issues are important, but they're a distraction from the real danger, which is a rogue superintelligence that could end humanity. But the paper has a fascinating response. It makes a distinction between a decisive existential risk, that's your single catastrophic event like a rogue AI, and an accumulative risk. An accumulative risk is more like death by 1,000 cuts, a slow, steady erosion of our social and economic systems. And the paper argues that mass unemployment and economic chaos is an accumulative existential risk. It creates the kind of instability and social breakdown that can absolutely lead to societal collapse. It's just an existential threat that plays out in slow motion. So that really brings us to the paper's final point, which feels less like a summary and more like a call to action for everyone in this field. Exactly. The big takeaway is this: thinking about the future of work isn't a distraction from AI safety. It is essential to it. The paper's final stance is that an AI that completely destabilizes our society and economy is by definition not safe, regardless of whether it ever becomes a superintelligence or not. And that leaves us with a really provocative question to think about. We spend so much time looking for these existential threats in the distant future, but what if the most immediate one isn't out there somewhere? What if it's the slow, systemic erosion of human agency and meaningful work that's happening right in front of us?